Oh my God. Big Joel going after John Mcwhorter. How dare he? Okay. We're John Mcwhorter fans here. John Mcwhorter is a great stream with Glenn Lowry. They talk about all sorts of interesting things, but I guess, John Mcwhorter, he's a liberal who doesn't like wokeness, and he's black, and I mean, I guess that's not acceptable in today's climate, right? So let's see what Joel here has to say about John Mcwhorter.
As of the time I'm writing this, Israel has killed more than 34,000 Palestinians, mostly civilians. And they've displaced far, far more than that, leaving millions of people in extreme danger and without sufficient aid. These acts can conservatively be called war crimes, a fact so obvious I hardly feel the need to say it. Still, just a few hours ago, news came out of a possible ceasefire being brokered, and I am hopeful. Hopeful that the killings of the present moment can end, and hopeful that maybe we can finally construct some kind of lasting peace, an end to the debilitating blockades, the poverty, and the daily humiliations that have pervaded the lives of Palestinians for so long.
Have we got verification of any of those numbers? Everyone's always throwing numbers out. And look, I don't believe anything Big Joel says. Like he says 34,000 dead, and I'm just like, is that correct?
No one really knows what the numbers are, obviously, because you rely on Hamas essentially to generate those numbers. So
yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's not clear what the numbers are. And then, but it's interesting, obviously it's a fact that there's war crimes, which obviously war crimes require, a certain intention of intending to or recklessly, just wiping out civilians, which, I mean, he just says that's a fact, but okay. I guess Joel is the arbiter of all things in terms of understanding this conflict. But it is interesting that the whole framing of it in terms of a lasting peace, it is all completely like, we must restore the peace and dignity of the Palestinian people, right? There's no concern whatsoever for, let's make sure that these people can live next to each other without killing each other, right?
Right, sure,
nothing about the security concern that obviously was shown to be completely legitimate on October 7th. So,
right, and most people would say that terrorist attacks are not really a dignified act. So, I mean, they're somewhat responsible for their own dignity a bit.
Yeah, of course. And actually, this plays directly into you, wanting to throw out identity politics as dignity politics, because he's directly, referring to the dignity of the people, which to me, it's more like, well, let's try to craft a home and a future for yourself and your children, right?
Yeah. Let's talk about behavior.
Yeah.
Rate, recently in the United States, a number of high-profile college campuses started protesting Israel's actions, the most notable of these protests, of course, being Columbia, where a number of student protesters were suspended and arrested. Just a fun fact, I actually went out to the Columbia protests for a few hours. My friends snuck me onto the campus. Conveniently for me, a good number of students actually recognized me, so I got to talk to them, and I have to tell you, from my perspective, they seemed just aggressively normal. They were just nice young people who were protesting in obvious injustice.
Now, I don't know if you know this, Sitch, but unless someone recognizes you as like a D-list YouTube celebrity, you can't actually speak with them. It's physically impossible. So
That is true. Right. I mean, it is hilarious that he's like, oh yeah, all the people at this protest, right? This contentious protest about, is it supporting Palestinians? Is it supporting Hamas? People were shouting from the river to the sea. And he's like, oh yeah, like they all recognize me.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, and what a coincidence. All the people that recognize me, well, they're all just the best people, don't you know? Okay, they're all just a bunch of good, down-to-earth, innocent children. They did nothing wrong. They all have the correct opinion, just like I do.
Of course.
So ridiculous.
Of course. After taking in my gaslighting on YouTube for years and years and years, they both recognize me and agree with me at the pro-Palestine protest, right?
Oh my God, this is so insane.
It all makes perfect sense. What a coincidence.
Anyway, given my narrow personal experience, I have to say I was a bit surprised to read some of the opinion pieces generated about these Columbia students by America's most prestigious newspapers. Some of these guys seem to think these students weren't nice, weren't normal, but were instead violent and nasty. So there's a few of these articles I could talk about, but I decided to focus on one because it is, frankly, just a bit of a gold mine. I'm going to respond to John Mcwhorter's New York Times opinion piece, "I'm a Columbia professor. The protests on my campus are not justice." This is a very, very podcasty video, by the way. Don't feel the need to look at this one. Nothing much is going to happen on the screen. And with that, I guess we'll just get into it. Mcwhorter writes, "Last Thursday, in the music humanities class I teach at Columbia University, 2 students were giving an in-class presentation on the composer John Cage. His most famous piece is 433, which directs us to listen in silence to surrounding noise for exactly that amount of time. I had to tell the students we could not listen to that piece that afternoon because the surrounding noise would have not been birds or people walking by in the hallways, but infuriated chanting from protesters outside the building. Lately, that noise has been almost continuous during the day and into the evening, including lusty chanting of 'From the River to the Sea.' 2 students in my class are Israeli, 3 others, to my knowledge, are American Jews. I couldn't see making them sit and listen to this as if it were background music." So, the first 2 paragraphs of this article tell a fun vignette about how this poor professor couldn't teach John Cage 433, and I guess there's a few things we could say about this. I could meditate on 433 and its meaning for a little while, but I'm not going to do that because blatantly the only reason this professor invokes this piece of silent music is to get at the basic point: it's too noisy out there. I'm sorry, could we be a little less loud? I can't even hear the birds with all your chanting. Free speech is free speech, but this has gone too far. What with all the noise? Mcwhorter continues, "I thought about what would have happened if protesters were instead chanting anti-black slogans, or even something like DEI has got to die to the same sound-off tune that 'From the River to the Sea' has been adapted to. They would have lasted roughly 5 minutes before the masses of students shouted them down and drove them off the campus. Chants like that would have been condemned as a grave rupture of civilized exchange, heralded as threatening resegregation, and branded as a form of violence. I'd wager that most of the student protesters against the Gaza war would view them that way. Why do so many people think that weeks-long campus protests against not just the war in Gaza, but Israel's very existence are nevertheless permissible?" So over the course of his career, Mcwhorter has written a number of articles like this, the Know Nothing Campus Protest Movement. Articles where he gets mad at students for protesting conservative speakers like Milo Yiannopoulos, where he talks about echo chambers and how awful they are, where he talks about the importance of free speech. And because of that, I think, Mcwhorter now feels he has to play the part of someone who's, merely pointing out hypocrisy. Why would you guys dislike bad racism on campus, but be okay with pro-Palestine, anti-Israel discourse on campus? You guys don't make any sense. You're phonies. So what we're seeing here, basically, is Mcwhorter assuming his beliefs as fact rather than attending to the merits of the argument. He doesn't have to argue that anti-Israel.
So wait. This is just the stunning levels of hypocrisy and ignorance, I guess, from Joel are just overwhelming me. Okay. You have a situation where he frames it. Okay. He very dishonestly frames what John Mcwhorter said as, "Oh, you're against bad racism on campus? Then why are you also not against pro-Palestinian chants?" Right? And it's like, no, that's not the issue. The issue is he's saying, John Mcwhorter is saying, "From the River to the Sea" is perceived by many students as meaning get rid of Israel entirely or get rid of the Jews from the region. Okay, that's how people perceive it. They're perceiving it on the same level, if not the worst level, that people would perceive Milo Yiannopoulos talking or any of the other things that the left has been shouting to eliminate from college campuses for the last 10 years. And Joel just recast it as like, "Oh, it's just pro-Palestinian chants." It's so dishonest. And now he's saying, well, why isn't John Mcwhorter engaging with the argument after he's just strawman the fuck out of John Mcwhorter's argument?
It's horrible.
Have to argue that anti-Israel advocacy is just as bad as white supremacist advocacy. He just kind of assumes it with a what if? What if they were the same? But perhaps that's unfair. In the following paragraphs, he tries to add just a bit of nuance to the conversation. He writes,
It's again, Joel, like socialists don't care about having a universal liberal standard of anything. Okay. Of saying like here's a set of universal rules that applies to everyone equally. They don't believe or in that, they don't care about that. They're all just my side is the oppressed side. My side is the morally right side, so therefore the other side can just pound sand. Right?
Right. And we can do detestable things because we're oppressed as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. And so it's again hilarious. Joel's like, why is he not engaging with the argument when Joel's argument is just, I'm morally right, you're morally wrong, so shut up. That is his
Right.
argument. That's all he's been saying this whole time.
Although I know many Jewish people will disagree with me, I don't think that Jew hatred is as much the reason for this sentiment as opposition to Zionism and the war on Gaza. I know some of the protesters, including a couple who were taken to jail last week, and I find it very hard to imagine that they are anti-Semitic. Yes, there can be a fine line between questioning Israel's right to exist and questioning Jewish people's right to exist, and yes, some of the rhetoric amid the protest crosses it. Pro-Palestinian rallies and events, of which there have been many here over the years, are not in and of themselves hostile to Jewish students, faculty, and staff members. Disagreement will not always be a juice and cookies affair. So I guess that seems okay. Like, I have some problems with his language, but it's an okay start. But let's see how he follows it up. However, the relentless assault of this current protest, daily louder into the night, and using ever angrier rhetoric, is beyond what any people should be expected to bear up under, regardless of their whiteness, privilege, or power. Social media discussion has been claiming that the protests are peaceful. They are, some of the time. It varies by location and day. Generally, what goes on within the campus gates is somewhat less strident than what happens just outside of them, but relatively constant are the drum beats. People will differ on how peaceful that sound can ever be, just as they will differ on the nature of anti-Semitism. Wow, that's a lot, isn't it? A lot going on there.
So before we get into a lot going on there, I have the article open, the original article John Mcwhorter wrote. Okay. Joel cut out a very interesting paragraph in between all this stuff. So let me read it to you. Okay. So this is, and I'll read the first part where it started, and then I'll read the part that he cut out. Okay. So he's talking about the whole like, is it you can be against Zionism without being anti-Semitic. Okay. Even though if some people question that. And then right after that, he says, conversations I've had with people heatedly opposed to the war in Gaza, signage and writing on social media and elsewhere, and anti-Israel and general hard leftist comments that I've heard for decades on campuses place these confrontations within a larger battle against power structures, here in the form of what they call colonialism and genocide, and against whiteness. The idea is that Jewish students and faculty should be able to tolerate all this because they are white.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Which is a very important part to this entire equation, a very important part to the hypocrisy that John Mcwhorter is pointing to. And it's very interesting to me that Joel leaves all of that out when he reads the article.
Right. They should be able to take the intimidation because they're the oppressors.
Yes, right. We get the whole systemic, it's okay to call white people cracker because of systemic racism, P plus P equals R, blah, 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 blah.
Right. I mean, I agree with Mcwhorter on these protests are a form of intimidation. Like it seems like that's exactly what's going on in these protests. So even if Joel is just saying, "Oh, look, it's just they're just playing their drums, right? They're just protesting." Like the point of chanting from the river to the sea is to intimidate, right?
Yeah, right. What is the point of doing that? How does that signify to the college administrators that you want to divest from Israel?
Well, the Finkelstein clip that we listened to, where Finkelstein basically said, it's probably not good optics for us to be chanting from the river to the sea because, well, some people say it's innocuous, other people say it's very incendiary, right? It means death to Israel. So the response to that was, one of the students took the microphone and immediately started chanting from the river to the sea. It was obviously kind of in an intimidation sort of zeal that she did that. That was my read of the situation. Was your read similar? Or?
Yeah, I don't know if I use the word intimidation. I use more as like smug condescension fuckery, which I think a lot of these, so much of what's going on in these campuses to me reads as kids looking for ways to attack adults, um,
Right.
intellectually, rhetorically, ideologically, because like that gives them little hits of dopamine, is to be able to crap on an adult and say, I'm better than you,
Right.
and to kind of do the smug face. And that's really how that all read to me, the from the river to the sea thing in that context.
Right. Right. Well, I
But
mean,
obviously,
I would categorize that as a type of intimidation. Obviously,
sure,
you're
sure,
saying,
sure.
F you.
Right. And definitely, I mean, that was sort of, a lot of the Maoist revolution was sort of radicalizing college students to do, college age students to do that exact thing to the
Yeah.
adults. So,
Yes. Yeah.
So this article is ostensibly about the injustice of current Colombia protests. That is the name of the piece. And thus far, 7 paragraphs in, the only injustice that he's pointed to is that the protesters are loud. It's the John Cage defense again. He writes in this extremely weak way too, at least in these paragraphs. People
well, this is just so dishonest. Okay. Because again, he's leaving. It's not that they're loud. It's they're loud and that they're saying this thing from the river to the sea and other things that Jewish people interpret as calling for them to be violently wiped out.
Right.
That like Joel is so disgustingly dishonest to leave all that context out and just say, "Oh, John Mcwhorter just doesn't like loud noises. He's scared by loud noises."
will differ on how peaceful that sound can ever be. But of course, the protests are peaceful, and that's true even though they chant and make a lot of noise. In fact, the very insinuation that protesters chanting is itself violent is essentially making the argument that there is no such thing as a peaceful protest. This is, after all, what protesters do. They yell slogans and sing songs and hit drums. If you can't allow for that, then you just think protests are intrinsically violent. Which, and I have to emphasize this, is fucking dumb and useless as a claim. The NYPD itself has better standards than this. They claim that the students they arrested were being peaceful. But to be fair, I guess the loud noises just really frightened Mcwhorter and perhaps even made him piss his pants out of raw terror. Maybe he pissed himself. Anyway, anyway.
He just the noises were so loud as I lie about his position. He peed his pants. He peed and poopied his pants, everybody, because the drums. Jesus
Yeah.
Christ. This is like
Well, I mean, obviously you can protest in a number of different ways.
right,
There is violent intimidation protests, right?
right.
There is, persuasion, try to talk people into something, right?
Hmm.
People are saying that the protests are leaning towards violent intimidation.
Of
Even look,
course.
you don't have to lift a finger to threaten people, right?
Of course. Right.
Yeah.
And there's also there's just the gaslighting now too. The Big Joel lying about John McWhorter's position and gaslighting and pretending like he doesn't understand what the argument is.
Big Joel doesn't. He might not understand though.
He does. I don't listen. Joel could be stupid. I don't think he's so stupid. He doesn't understand the argument about from the river to the sea. This is
Oh,
all
he
just a
definitely
gaslighting performance for his audience.
he understands that
Yeah,
argument.
100%.
He's just
That's
he's retreating to, as long as they're just saying words, this isn't violence, obviously, right? Violence is when you actually pick up
right.
your, you throw something or throw a fist or something like that, right?
Sure,
If you
sure.
make violent threats, that's actually peaceful.
Yeah, exactly. Because and you know that if there was just I don't know some movement associated with that Joel associated with racism, right? That
Hmm.
he associated as like these are the evil white right wingers that want to drum black people out of colleges. If they weren't saying anything, they were just banging on drums, right in the quad. He'd say
Oh,
like that sound represents, the oppression that they feel emotionally. Blah blah blah.
yeah, you'd say that's violent intimidation, obviously.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what John McWhorter said. That's his exact point.
Yeah, it is.
It's easy to see through Anyway, it's easy to see through Mcwhorter's bullshit as he continues to write this. What I do know is that even the most peaceful of protests would be treated as outrages if they were interpreted as, say, anti-black, even if the message were coded as in a bunch of people quietly holding up MAGA signs or wearing t-shirts saying all lives matter.
So, okay, look, John Mcwhorter perfectly clearly lays it out, right? Is Joel going to say like, oh, you know what? Maybe that should be allowed. Maybe that's fine to have on campus and no one complain, right?
Could we have a rally where people just wear all lives matter shirts
On
and
a college
or is that
campus?
like is that
No,
violence?
I don't think that would be allowed on a college campus.
Okay. I think it should be allowed though, right? I
I
mean,
agree. I
that's not
agree.
too incendiary.
No,
Maybe some MAGA signs.
sure. If he's a presidential candidate.
Yeah.
Remember when there was a sitting congressperson wrote an article, an op-ed for the New York Times, and it
Yeah.
was,
Tom Cotton,
so,
right?
yes, it was Tom Cotton, and it was so attacked that even though he explicitly said that, it was during the BLM protests, and he was talking about reestablishing order, and even though he explicitly said that not all the protesters are violent, and he wasn't saying for a crackdown on violence, he's talking about crackdown on the rioting and the looting that would take place after all the protests, even though he made all these, concessions and considerations in the op-ed, he still not only did he get attacked, but the publication got attacked, and the guy ended up getting fired slash forced out just because he allowed a sitting congressperson to write an op-ed about a heated political situation that was happening at the time.
I remember all that. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But then Joel's here is gonna sit here and pretend like he doesn't understand what John McWhorter's talking about.
Let's see that.
So, yeah, obviously his problem with these protesters is not really what they do. That will become increasingly obvious, I promise you. His problem is with their message. He disagrees with them, he doesn't like the things they're saying, and he'd like for them to be made to stop. The issue there, though, is that if he just said that out loud, he'd reveal himself to be a fundamentally illiberal actor who disdains free speech even as he pretends to celebrate it.
So wait, maybe you're right. Maybe Joel is just an idiot. Because how could you read that little sentence and come away with that interpretation at all?
Yeah.
John McWhorter is laying out the logic to saying, okay, the left is being these leftist students are being completely hypocritical in how they want to behave. And Joel just says, oh, well, it's obviously he just doesn't support the message. It's like, wait, that's not has nothing to do with what he's talking about at all. Do you think John McWhorter is in favor of people going around college campuses saying things that would be interpreted as anti-black? He's black. He doesn't want people doing that.
Yeah, he said that many times.
Like,
So, he lies and calls the speech he doesn't like violence. A very clever trick. I imagine that Mcwhorter's largely dumb baby readership would be swayed by it.
A trick that I see people like Big Joel doing all the time.
yes,
That's like their trick.
this entire video is that trick, is him just gaslighting his audience, pretending he doesn't understand this very, very easy to understand argument to try to create a frame that his audience could just sit there and pretend like, oh, he's just, John McWhorter's just a liar. He's just an idiot.
Yeah. You against trans women in sports? Violence.
Right.
Maybe I'm being unfair here, though. Maybe I'm jumping the gun, because in the very next paragraph, Mcwhorter finally tries to persuade us that what's happening during these Columbia protests is violence. Like, he finally gives us examples. And besides, calling all of this peaceful stretches the use of the word rather implausibly. It's an odd kind of peace when a local rabbi urges Jewish students to go home as soon as possible, when an Israeli Arab activist is roughed up on Broadway, when the angry chanting becomes so constant that you almost start to not hear it, and it starts to feel normal to see posters and clothing portraying members of Hamas as heroes. Okay, so let's go through this list of three.
Wow. Is that really happening?
Yeah, that happened. Right.
Posters of Hamas being portrayed as heroes.
I've seen things like that happen.
That's
Sure.
a little
Right.
harsh.
Yeah.
things one by one. Mcwhorter's first example is that a local Orthodox rabbi told Jewish students not to come to campus because they might face violence. I don't know if I need to say anything about this, but I guess I have to. Someone warning people that violence might occur is not the same as violence occurring. If I say there may be a chocolate cake in your refrigerator, that doesn't materialize the cake, right? That's not how this works. His second example is that a pro-Israel activist.
Okay. So it's so funny that like Joel and the leftists who, we need trigger warnings, we need to listen and believe the voices of, oppressed people. It doesn't matter what the actual facts are. What matters is what their perception of reality is, right? If someone who's in an oppressed position, a minority oppressed position, feels like you're saying something that's, triggering them, that's, a potential threat for them, you need to bend over backwards and take their feelings into consideration, right? Unless it's Jews. And unless it's Jews relating to the Israel-Palestine situation, then the Jews just have to grow a thicker skin because they're white and thus higher or lower, I guess, on the oppression hierarchy, so they can just F off, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what's going on.
Activists confronting some pro-Palestine protesters got punched in the face by one of those protesters. Now, this is by far Mcwhorter's most compelling example. I mean, this is obviously a case of violence occurring, and it's honestly a bit strange that he sandwiched this example between two bits of nonsense. There are two problems here, though. The first is, this happened outside of Columbia's campus, so you can't really cite it as an example of the Columbia student protest being violent, and he very much seems to want to claim that it is. Second, I just don't think one isolated case of violence between protesters and counter-protesters is enough to call a massive citywide protest categorically violent. I'd probably feel different if a more serious injury were caused or if a lot of people were getting punched, but as it stands, I just don't think this is a good enough case for the massive claim that Mcwhorter is trying to make. His third example is that the chanting has become so constant that it starts to feel normal, and we've been here before. We're back to just calling loud people violent. I truly don't understand how one person can milk a truly meaningless talking point for this long. I don't know how to keep responding to it. It's too dumb. Mcwhorter finishes this paragraph with the
well, you could not lie, right? You could actually address the argument that it's not simply the volume, but it is the content of the speech, right? That he's referring to. If it was just a bunch of people saying, ceasefire now, I don't think John Mcwhorter
as loud
would,
as they want.
Right. Yeah. I don't think John Mcwhorter would be writing this article. Okay. And also, did you notice, even though he read it originally, he left out the last example. Did you notice he left out the last example? Because I guess he couldn't create some kind of BS pithy retort to it. The last example was, it starts to feel normal for people to see posters and clothing portraying members of Hamas as heroes.
Yeah.
Joel doesn't have he just skipped over that one, I guess.
I mean, that one's so harsh. I mean, it really
Right.
is not the kind of thing you want to see.
Right. So
It's kind of like seeing swastikas all over your college campus, which Joel obviously is not going to be in favor of.
Of course.
The
Could you
old
imagine if
swastika floating around?
There was some group? Could you imagine if the Groypers, started to come to college campuses and they started screeching about we need a unified Reich, REICH, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you think, oh, they're talking about the Nazis, right? The Third Reich again and again and again. And then when you asked them, he said, what? No, we're not talking about the Nazis. We're talking about the Weimar Republic. That was the Second Reich. We don't mean the Third Reich. What? Just, why should we let the Nazis have this slogan, right? This is like from the river to the sea thing. It's like, well, wait a minute. What? No, we mean it in this completely different context.
Yeah, well, we know they'd be gaslighting.
Of course.
Which I suspect some gaslighting is going on with the river to the sea stuff. But
yeah.
Following, and it's perhaps the lowest rating I have ever read. The other night, I watched a dad coming from the protest with his little girl, giving a good hard few final snaps on the drum he was carrying, nodding at her in crisp salute, percussing his perspective into her little mind. This is not peaceful. Yep, you heard it here first, folks. It's violent to, It's violent when the child is around people who don't like war crimes. Girl, what the fuck are you talking about? What are you talking about? What are you talking about?
This is like the leftist aesthetic, okay? To take something someone says and dissect it into past the point of it actually making sense or, what the person intended to mean, and then just say, oh, look at this stupid person. He said a stupid thing. Okay. Because very often, very obviously, if you understand English, there's a reason that John Mcwhorter wrote that whole thing as one paragraph. Okay. So what John Mcwhorter is saying, I guess I'll have to spell out the drill here. He's saying when you have a situation where a local rabbi, and Jewish students don't feel safe on college campuses enough that they're urging Jewish students to not go to college campuses. When you have an Israeli activist who is roughed up, at least fairly though, is roughed up not directly on the college campus, okay, but is outside the college campus. He's roughed up on his way to go to the college to give some kind of speech or something. Okay,
Right.
you have that happen. You have people who have been chanting from the river to the sea so much it's ingrained itself in your psyche that not hearing it seems odd to you. And then you also have people that are putting up posters of Hamas or dressing like Hamas members, and that is kind of showing them to be heroes. Okay. And you have all that in a context where you see parents sort of indoctrinating children with all of those things in their mindsets. Okay. That's what John Mcwhorter is talking about. I know that Joel isn't intelligent enough to grasp, the paragraph.
Yeah, the equivalent would kind of be a father with a small child at a Nazi rally,
Right.
right?
Right. And it would be like, if just imagine if there was a kid at the Charlottesville protest, okay?
Oh, sure,
And,
yeah,
there was a kid, and the kid wasn't saying, Jews would not replace us, but he had a little drum and was beating it in time, with everything. And
sure.
someone, some author wrote about that, right? And you're just like, well, you
Yes.
think drumming is violent? You guys are so stupid. I can't believe you.
Yeah, it's a surrounding context, obviously.
You're writing this paragraph like you saw like the war, like you're writing like you're in the trenches of World War One. Meanwhile, you saw a child with a drumming father. You're so weird. Anyway, let's just keep reading with another slightly more equivocal passage. I understand that the protesters and their fellow travelers feel that all of this is the proper response, social justice on the march. They have been told that righteousness means placing the battle against whiteness and its power front and center, contesting the abuse of power by any means necessary. And I think the war on Gaza is no longer constructive or even coherent. However, the issues are complex in ways that this uncompromising brand of power battling is ill-suited to address. Legitimate questions remain about the definition of genocide, about the extent of a nation's right to defend itself, and about the justice of partition, which has not historically been limited to Palestine. There is a reason many consider the Israeli-Palestinian conflict the most morally challenging in the modern world. So these paragraphs are doing something that I personally like to call Zeno's arrow of moral equivocation. The issue is complicated, so saith Mcwhorter, and because of its complexity, we can never choose a side and take that side seriously. Don't you see? We can't protest Israel's actions yet. We still have to answer questions about what constitutes a genocide. We still don't know what rights a nation has to defend itself.
Well, I'm sorry. Where in this publication did John Mcwhorter say that you're not allowed to protest Israel's actions? Where does he say
Nowhere.
that? Yeah.
Never.
Oh, he didn't say that anywhere? Oh, so it's just another example of Joel lying off his ass again and again and again while reading this article.
Right. Yeah. John Mcwhorter's in favor of you protesting, just not chanting death to Israel. I
Right.
mean, it's a pretty clear
Yeah.
distinction.
Right.
These kinds of questions, you may notice, can go on for the rest of our lives. They're very philosophical and loose in nature, and I doubt Mcwhorter would ever come to an answer he was happy with. And because of that, we can just always refuse the possibility of moral conviction. He even says that he doesn't find the Gaza war constructive, and yet the idea of protesting it is still unthinkable to him for some reason. The article is winding down.
See, okay.
Yeah,
Maybe you're right.
why?
Maybe Joel is just so dumb. His head is so far up the ass of the leftist socialist bubble that he cannot even possibly perceive at all that someone would interpret the phrase from the river to the sea as meaning violence. Or he's just lying again off his ass, just incredibly dishonest, and he keeps reframing it, gassing up his audience, gaslighting his audience into this, well, it's just he's just against protesting against Israel, even though he himself says both that he thinks personally the war is not even coherent at this point. Okay, that's what in this article he says no longer constructive or even coherent. And Joel is still lying about his position here.
But we'll just keep reading. We'll keep plumbing the depths. Mcwhorter writes, when I was at Rutgers in the mid-1980s, the protests were against investment in South Africa's apartheid regime. There were similarities with the Columbia protests now. A large number of students established an encampment site right in front of the Rutgers Student Center on College Avenue, where dozens slept every night for several weeks. Among the largely white crowd, participation was a badge of civic commitment. There was chanting, along with the street theater inevitable and perhaps even necessary to effective protests. One guy even lay down in the middle of College Avenue to block traffic, taking a page from the Vietnam protests. I don't recall South Africans on campus feeling personally targeted, but the bigger difference was that though the protesters sought to make their point at high volume over a long period, and sometimes even rudely, they did not seek to all but shut down campus life. I don't even know what's going on here. I won't lie to you. Like, he says that in the past he liked the anti-apartheid protests, which were loud and disruptive and which involved one student blocking traffic, and then he attempts to claim that the current Columbia protests aren't like that at all, but his reasons just don't make any sense. The first thing he says is, I don't recall South Africans on campus feeling personally targeted, and it's like, you don't recall them feeling targeted? What do you know? How many South African Rutgers students were you familiar with? There must be 10, 20, 50 times the number of pro-Israel people on Columbia's campus than there were pro-apartheid South Africans on Rutgers campus in the 1980s. And honestly, do you really think those pro-apartheid students didn't feel targeted? Do you think they felt comfortable airing out those beliefs in public?
He's incapable.
It's
He's
so bad.
incapable of not lying. It's like insane to me. He says South African students, okay? South African students, obviously referring to the South African white students, saying like, yeah, you could protest against apartheid without calling for violence against white South African students, right?
Right, right.
That's what he's saying. It's so easily clear. And Joel's like, what about the pro-apartheid student? Oh my God. He's so dumb. He's so dishonest when he reads this article.
It is pretty funny though. Like it's just he well look, it's a mystery whether or not he gets it or he's just
An idiot.
whether he's dishonest or stupid. That's
Right.
always the two choices, right? Are you
Well,
dishonest or stupid?
and then it's even funnier because so Joel opens this video by saying like, listen, I went personally to this campus for like a couple hours. Okay. So I know what's up, right? I
Right,
went there. And yet he's saying that John Mcwhorter, who's a teacher there, who's definitely spent significantly more time,
Yeah,
there than
years
Joel is there.
teaching different students.
Right. And was even there in the mid 1980s, when the apartheid protests were going on. And Joe's like, well, what does he know? What does his personal experience mean? My personal experience for going there for 3 hours, shows me I know everything about this protest movement.
No, spare me. There's no way. The second thing he says is even stranger somehow. The apartheid protesters didn't seek to shut down campus life. Dude, you just said one guy laid down in the middle of traffic. You said they were loud and chanted a lot for weeks. The very same thing that you call violence in the Columbia protests. No, the real difference between these two protests is obvious. So obvious that I have to imagine Mcwhorter is just lying. He agrees fully with the anti-South Africa advocacy of the 1980s, and he's pretty damn unsympathetic to the anti-Israel advocacy of today. Fucking doy.
Even though he literally said a paragraph ahead that he doesn't actually agree with Israel's war in Gaza right now.
Right. Yeah.
And yet Joel is like, no, he's just lying. Okay. Even though if Joel would just keep reading the article, he explains exactly what he means. Okay. But we
Yeah,
only
he's
have like a minute left, so I don't know. Maybe Joel just does, maybe he just stops reading here to again lie about John McWhorter's position.
Okay, let's just finish up with the last two
Okay, here we go.
paragraphs. Today's protesters don't hate Israel's.
Oh, look at this. He skipped a paragraph.
oh, he
Joel
did?
lies again, skips a paragraph. Okay. Shock, shock. So after that paragraph that John McWhorter writes about over a long that they were high at a high volume at a long period of time and rudely, but they did not seek to all but shut down college life or college campus. This is the next paragraph that Joel cuts out. On Monday night, Columbia announced that classes would be hybrid until the end of semester in the interest of student safety. I presume that the protesters will continue throughout the 2 main days of graduation, besmirching one of the most special days of thousands of graduates' lives in the name of calling down the imperialist war abroad. Okay.
Right.
So when he talks about shutting down college campus life, what he's talking about is that making the classes, be online, actually shutting down the college campus, which did happen, and possibly stopping the graduation ceremony, which is what the college protesters at Columbia were trying to do. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
But
I wonder
Joel
how much.
just cuts that all out of the article. So John McWhorter seems crazy.
Yeah, I wonder how much of that was just impossible back before they could do remote learning and stuff like that.
Right. That's a good
Because
point. Yeah.
they were like, look, we're going to put an end to these protests before that happens. But now they kind of have an alternative. So,
Hmm.
but yes, he completely misrepresents John McWhorter's article here and in a nefarious way.
Government
Yes.
any more than yesterday's hated South Africa's. But they have pursued their goals with a markedly different tenor, in part because of the single-mindedness of anti-racist academic culture, and in part because of the influence of iPhones and social media, which inherently encourage a more heightened degree of performance. It is part of the warp and woof of today's protests that they are being recorded from many angles for the world to see. One speaks up. But these changes in moral history and technology can hardly be expected to comfort Jewish students in the here and now. What began as intelligent protest has become, in its uncompromising fury and its ceaselessness, a form of abuse. A form of abuse. The people protesting are doing an abuse. They're problematic. They're gaslighting me. I can't even teach my precious 433. This is an act of violence. On the topic of violence, you might notice one glaring omission from this opinion piece. The actual violence that occurred during this protest, the 108 peaceful students that were arrested by the NYPD. Students who were detained by force for protesting the Israeli government and its crimes against Gaza. But of course, John McWhorter couldn't mention that, could he? Because he agrees with that violence. Anyway, that's all I have to say. It's 3:15 a.m. as I'm recording this. I wrote this entire thing in the last 2 hours. I don't know why I'm doing this, but I hope you liked it. I hope you enjoyed.
Yeah, Sitch, you sounds like you loved it.
Oh my God. Disgusting. Terrible. I mean, it's just like, first of all, again, the last part of John McWhorter's article, he says, what began as an intelligent protest has become, in its uncompromising fury and ceaselessness, a form of abuse. So again, it's showing that John McWhorter agreed with the earlier parts of it and was in favor of people protesting against the war, or even the right to protest against the war. And now saying, well, something has definitely changed, right? The content or the character of the protests have changed, something which Joel completely glosses over. He's like, well, why doesn't he talk about like the violence of them getting arrested after they, I don't know, took over a building, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The content of the message in the beginning was about, over the overzealousness of Israel and creating collateral damage and advocating for a ceasefire. And it's morphed into Israel's got to go. Right.
Yes, exactly.
So it's
Which
a
is
completely
crazy.
different, yeah, it's
Yeah.
a completely different message. And that message is I mean, I don't know how that message can't be interpreted as violence.
Hmm.
If you're saying, look, it's Israel's got to go,
Well, and
right?
also, so I just looked it up. Again, another blatant dishonesty or stupidity from Joel here. This article was written on April 23rd.
Right.
Okay. That is the day, um, that is the day before the college campus said that they had to leave. Okay. So when he's like, oh, John Mcwhorter, he doesn't mention the violence of the police coming in and arresting all of them. Well, that's because he doesn't have a time machine. Okay. He wrote this article before anyone was arrested by the police.
That's hilarious. God,
So,
he's
it's so
so,
stupid.
it's so bad. It's so bad. Oh man. Big Joel, all he does is false accusations.
Hmm. Yeah, because it was April 29th is when the students said that they were at an impasse. Well, the university and students both said they were impasse with each other. And then the next day, on April 30th, which is the day that Joel uploaded this video, April 30th, is the day where the student protesters occupied that building. And
Okay.
they had to call the police in and they started arresting people. Okay. So Big Joe, when he says, oh, he's not talking about the police coming in and using physical violence, he's referring to when the police had to drag people out of the building that they were occupying.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there you go. Dishonest, disgusting, Joel.
Hi, you just listened to a Sitch and Adam recorded video. That's right, we're still doing recorded videos. And of course, we're still doing our live streams. Our Sunday live stream begins at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And our daily live streams start at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. Come check it out. You're gonna love it. Subscribe to this channel right here to watch the live show or watch more of our awesome deep dive videos.